Good evening, everyone. So, today we will continue with the second tutorial of Basics of Biology course. And this is actually supposed to be, this tutorial was supposed to be on previous Sunday, but it had to be postponed. This tutorial session, we will be summarizing the content of week 2 and then look at few questions. Okay, so I will start sharing my screen. And in case someone wants to join the call in between, I won't be able to see that. Any one of you can please unmute and let me know. Okay. Once I start presenting, I won't be able to know if someone else is wanting to join the call. Okay. So, this week's content mostly covered about the different how life formed on Earth and what were the theories pertaining to origin of life on earth, as well as the different theories of evolution. So we will go through all of that and look at few of the questions in the end. Okay, so in general, when we talk about the structure of the earth, if we really slice through the earth, then we have the outer core. I mean, the innermost hottest part of the earth is the inner core, then comes the outer core, then mantle and the crust. Okay, so crust, the thickness varies from in between 30 to 40 kilometers under continents to 7 to 10 kilometers under the ocean. And then we have inner core, outer core, mantle, and the crust. Here, the lithosphere, if we talk about the lithosphere, this portion here, it is the rigid outer layer of the earth that actually includes the crust as well as the upper mantle. Okay, upper mantle as well as the crust is like it comprises the lithosphere. Then we have asthenosphere here in this part, which is a hot mobile layer of partially molten rock. Then we have mantle, this complete thing, which is the solid layer between the crust and the earth's core. And then we have outer core, which is a fluidic layer mainly consisting of iron and nickel minerals, and inner core, solid hot spinning metal ball, that is the densest part of the earth. So, Earth's internal structure actually supports life. Okay, so it consists of crust, having low density silicate minerals, further divided into continental and oceanic crusts. Then we have mantle, which is the thick layer beneath the crust of silicate rocks, denser and higher in magnesium and iron. Then core is at the center, which is composed of a solid inner core, the densest part, and a liquid outer core. And these layers actually interact through processes like plate tectonics, volcanism, earthquakes, and mantle convection, which are actually essential for geological activity and formation of life. And Earth's layered structure actually has allowed for the development of continents, mountains, and oceans and other geographic features that we see, that eventually created the environments and the atmosphere that we can actually live in or thrive in. We, as in we and other living organisms, can thrive in. So, how exactly Earth's structure supports life? So, it has magnetic field protection. The core generated magnetic field, I mean, there should be a gap in between. Magnetic field prevents atmospheric erosion by solar wind, preserving water and essential gases. Then you have the movement of the plates and geological activity like mantle convection and tectonic activity, recycle the carbon and other elements, regulate climate and create diverse habitats. Then we have stable climate via moon and atmospheric conditions. The moon stabilizes the Earth's tilt, moderating seasonal extremes, whereas volcanic outgassing and oceans maintain a climate suitable for life. Then we have water and nutrient availability. Cooling of the surface actually has allowed the oceans to form, providing a medium for chemical reactions and the origin of life. We will eventually look into these things. Whereas tectonics and erosion distribute the nutrients essential for ecosystems, the for the ecosystems to thrive. Now, the Earth formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago from dust and gas in the early solar system. And intense bombardment and radioactive decay actually melted much of the planet, which eventually caused the heavy elements like iron and nickel to move towards the center, forming the core, whereas the lighter elements like silicates floated upward, creating the mantle and the crust. Eventually, this differentiation established the basic structure that we previously saw. And over geological time, cooling and plate motion have modified these layers slowly. Continents have grown, oceans opened and closed, and mountains, stood high or were eroded. Yet the internal layering remains the framework of Earth's evolution. So if we talk about the different elements, and these are mostly the composition of the crust portion, like Earth's crust, and like oxygen, silicon, aluminium, iron, calcium, sodium, potassium, magnesium, titanium, hydrogen, and other elements are actually in trace amounts. What we see in the highest amount is oxygen, which is the most abundant element in the crust, like on the crust. Okay. Now, in general, if we talk about the composition of each layer of the earth, what are the key elements and materials? Like crust is mainly dominated by silicate-rich rocks, and key elements or minerals are calcium, magnesium, oxygen, silicon, aluminium, iron, and then comes mantle, which again has silicate minerals rich in heavier elements, mainly oxygen, magnesium, silicate, and iron. And then we have the outer core. We are moving towards the innermost part. The outer core, which is a liquid metal layer, and mostly liquid iron, nearly 85%, with nickel, nearly 5%, and some lighter elements can also be found in the outer core, sulfur, oxygen, etc. And inner core, the densest part, is solid metal, primarily solid iron and nickel, which are actually under immense pressure. So how do we really know what actually lies inside? Okay, like at such deeper layers, it isn't like someone has gone inside and was able to see, because we can't really directly see what's inside the earth. So scientists learn about its interior by using indirect clues. The most important of these are the seismic waves generated by earthquakes, which actually eventually change the speed and direction depending on whether they move through solid, liquid, or less rigid materials. And eventually, by tracking how these waves bend and bounce, researchers can actually distinguish different internal layers with their own densities and compositions. And other evidence can come from meteorites, which actually can offer clues about the material that originally formed our planet. From Earth's magnetic field, we can get some clues which points to the flowing molten iron in the outer core, and from measurements of gravity, which actually reveal how dense materials are distributed deep inside the planet. So, if we talk about life on Earth, for life to thrive on Earth, we require like it requires a combination of chemical, environmental, and planetary conditions, which actually also includes the presence of essential organic molecules, water, energy resources, and a stable atmosphere and magnetic field. So, if we talk about the essential chemical elements and molecules, it is fundamentally carbon based, right? Because carbon can form different molecular structures, simple as well as complex molecular structures necessary for forming organic compounds or synthesizing organic compounds. In addition to carbon, life requires definitely hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, which combine to form the macromolecules, biological macromolecules like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, which eventually let the living organisms thrive. Nucleotides, fatty acids, sugars, and other essential biomolecules. So these basic molecules can actually spontaneously assemble when favorable conditions are there, as demonstrated in the Miller-Urey experiment. Miller-Urey experiment, we will look at it. They actually eventually kind of simulated the conditions on in primitive Earth, and eventually saw the formation using um, like under reducing conditions, and eventually saw the formation of very simple biomolecules. So we will go through Miller-Urey experiment as well. And additional sources of organic molecules include synthesis at deep sea hydrothermal vents and extraterrestrial input from meteorites and comets. So, on primitive Earth, what might be the energy sources for carrying out these chemical reactions? Primary energy sources included solar radiation, lightning, volcanic activity, and geothermal heat. And these energy inputs eventually enabled the formation of polymers and eventually self replicating molecules like RNA, which might have preceded DNA in storing genetic information. This is actually also what is being hypothesized in RNA world hypothesis, which actually suggests that the first primitive molecules to originate, like biomolecule to originate, is RNA because it can eventually self replicate as well, even before DNA. Then presence of liquid water is indispensable as it acts as a solvent for chemical reactions, facilitates molecular transport, and helps in stabilizing temperatures uh, necessary to uh, necessary for survival of living organisms. Oceans, pools, hydrothermal environments likely served as a primordial soup for the assembly of complex molecules into protocells and early cellular structures. So, if we talk about the planetary conditions that might have been really appropriate to eventually let life form on Earth, atmosphere and protecting magnetic field. Protective atmosphere actually shields life from harmful radiation and maintains a stable climate, while the Earth's magnetic field prevents atmospheric erosion by solar wind. And we also have an optimum distance from the sun, so the earth's position allows water to remain liquid. It's not really always frozen or completely evaporated. Planetary mass and lithosphere: a proper mass retains an atmosphere and provides solid support for continental and oceanic ecosystems. Then you have, we talked about it, like stabilization by the moon and gases. Then formation of protocells, organic molecules eventually organized into protocells, which are the terms which this term actually refers to self-assembling lipid structures capable of maintaining internal chemical gradients and encapsulating hereditary RNA molecules. So these protocells could replicate and evolve, giving rise to the first true cells approximately 3.5 uh, billion years ago. So, life actually did not emerge instantly, forming complex molecules and self replicating systems. It actually required millions to billions of years of chemical evolution under stable environmental conditions. Okay. Now, there are different theories that talk about how life might have originated on Earth. So, one such theory is the theory of special creation, which actually isn't scientific at all, and it the very early thinkers actually thought of like mostly this was put forward by Suarez, and the special creation theory said that life was created by some kind of divine being, and it was created in just 6 days. Since the beginning of time, the diversity of organisms has remained constant, and according to this theory, the diversity of life forms will not even change in future. So this is what the early thinkers suggested. However, there's no scientific basis, but this particular theory of special creation was widely accepted until the arrival of Darwinism, which is actually the first systematic statement of evolution. And early in the 20th century, the USA actually outlawed the teaching of evolution because it was in direct opposition to this theory of special creation. Such was the effect and the belief on this particular theory. So even there was this well-known Scopes trial where you guys can go back and read about it, where actually a high school instructor was uh, kind of tried in court and stuff. There was a case going on because John Scopes, was found guilty for promoting evolutionism. Okay, and the theory of special creation, the uh, book of Genesis actually lays the foundation for this particular theory. So the presumptions, if we summarize, all life forms were created at the same time and are unrelated to one another, according to theory of special creation. And life forms were created in their current state, so they have not undergone any changes. There has been virtually no evolution. And the bodies of the life forms and organs are designed to meet the needs of the environment completely. That is, there has been no adaptation. All right. So we now know that the theory of special creation definitely isn't valid. And The objections are it was purely based on religious beliefs, no experimental evidence, and the age of different fossils that we have actually proves that living organisms appear on Earth at different time points. Next came the theory of spontaneous generation, put forward by Greek philosopher Aristotle. So he proposed that life arose from non living material if the material contained pneuma or vital heat. He termed it as pneuma. So, as evidence, he actually noted several instances of animals appearing from environments, or in general, life forms appearing from environments where it didn't have anything earlier, such as the seemingly sudden appearance of fish in a new puddle of water. Okay, so this theory actually persisted till the 17th century, when eventually scientists and thinkers undertook additional experimentation to support, like, keep on propagating this theory of spontaneous generation, or they undertook certain experiments to eventually disprove it. So proponents of the theory or supporter of this theory of spontaneous generation eventually also cited like how frogs simply seem to appear along the muddy banks of Nile River in Egypt during the annual flooding. And others eventually observed that mice simply appeared among grain stored in barns with thatched roofs. So we are talking about really, really long time ago. And when the roof leaked and the grain molded, mice appeared. So this was what were things were proposed in the support of this particular theory of spontaneous generation. Then Helmont in 17th century proposed that mice could arise from rags and wheat kernels left in an open container for 3 weeks. And in reality, such habitats actually provided ideal food sources and shelter for mouse populations to flourish. But eventually, there was an Italian physician, Francisco Redi. He actually was the first to refute the idea that maggots spontaneously generate on meat. Maggots, or these are fly larvae. These spontaneously generate on meat left out in the open air. So he actually predicted that preventing. So he tried to refute this theory of spontaneous generation. So he predicted that if we prevent flies from having direct contact with the meat, it would also prevent the appearance of the larvae. Okay, so what he did, he left meat in 6 containers. Two were open to air, two covered with gauge, this one, and two covered with gauge, this one, and two was tightly sealed with cork. So maggots developed in uncovered jars, as seen here, open container formation of maggots in meat, but no maggots appeared in either gauge covered or tightly sealed jars. And maggots could only form when flies were allowed to lay eggs in the meat, and that the maggots were the offsprings of flies, not the product of spontaneous generation. This was his claim. Okay, so maggots only appeared on the meat in the open container. However, maggots were also eventually found on the gauge of the gauge covered container. Okay. So this was the so he tried to refute the claim. Next, another person, John Needham, he published a report of his own experiments where he briefly boiled a broth infused with plant or animal matter, in with the hope to kill all the pre-existing microbes, then sealed the flasks and observed that the broth had become cloudy and a single drop contained numerous microscopic creatures after a few days. So, with this observation, he argued that the new microbes eventually arose spontaneously in broth from a life force. However, now we know that in reality, he likely might not have boiled the broth enough to kill all the pre existing microbes, right? Or the sealing might not have been very proper, also. All right. So, and then Spallanzini was there. He did not agree with Needham's conclusions. So he eventually performed hundreds of carefully executed experiments using heated broth, and Spallanzini's results contradicted the findings of Needham. This one. So he heated but sealed the flasks. Like he actually eventually did like multiple experiments and heated it very strongly, and heated but sealed the flasks. These heated and sealed flasks remained clear without any signs of spontaneous growth unless when the flasks were subsequently opened to the air. So he suggested that the microbes were introduced into these flasks from the air. But again, there was counterattack by Needham, where he argued that life originates from a life force, and the life force was probably destroyed during Spallanzani's extended boiling and or heating. So any subsequent sealing of the flasks then prevented new life force from entering and causing spontaneous generation. So now, because we know how things work and how um, life thrives on Earth, now we might find this kind of a little silly, but however, at that point of time when there was no exposure to knowledge or any resources of that kind, so these thinkers came up with their own ideas, and this counterattack and all these debates continued, which eventually actually shaped science today, about what we know about evolution and science today. So but disproving this theory of spontaneous generation, this debate actually continued well into uh, well till the 19th century, and scientists were either supporting this theory or trying to disprove it. Then there was Paris Academy of Sciences, which actually eventually offered a prize for resolving this problem. Then Louis Pasteur came in the scenario. He was a French, um, he was French, and he used to he was a French chemist kind of, who was experimenting with fermentation and stuff like that. And so what he did, he accepted this challenge and filtered air through a gun cotton filter. And upon microscopic examination of the cotton, found it full of microbes, which eventually suggested that exposure of broth to air was not really introducing a life force to the broth, but it was actually introducing airborne microbes. Then eventually he made a series of flasks with long twisted necks, which he called neck flasks, and in which he boiled the broth to sterilize it. He allowed air inside the flasks to be exchanged with air from the outside, but prevented the introduction of any airborne microbes due to this twisted swan neck flasks. So he correctly predicted that sterilized broth in his own, in the twisted necks or swan neck flasks would remain sterile as long as the swan necks remained intact. However, whenever he even broke the necks, then microbes were introduced, which eventually contaminated the flasks and allowed the microbial growth within the broth. So Pasteur's set of experiments irrefutably disproved the theory of spontaneous generation and earned him the prestigious prize from Paris Academy. And eventually, he in a lecture in 1864, he articulated this particular life comes from life term. And in this lecture, Pasteur recounted his famous swan neck flask experiment, where he tells about life is a germ and germ is life. Never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. So this was this is Louis Pasteur. This was the swan neck flask he had designed, and the curve of the flask prevented outside air from entering the flask. No contamination occurred, and when he broke the neck, the bacteria or microbes can reach the sterile broth, and we, one he could see microbial growth inside. Now, there is another theory which is called theory of catastrophism, which suggests that Earth's geological and biological history have been shaped by a series of sudden, short lived, and often violent events or catastrophes that eventually caused mass extinctions and paved the way for new forms of life. So this was given by Cuvier, and according to Cuvier, each major catastrophe was followed by a period of new creation, explaining the abrupt changes one can see in the layers of fossil. So, what were the principles of this theory? Sudden events. Earth's feature and life forms changed rapidly due to catastrophic natural disasters like floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Mass extinctions. So, due to these sudden events, the existing species were wiped out, leaving gaps in the fossil record. Then multiple creations, and after each catastrophic event, new species appeared, either created anew or migrated from unaffected regions. And catastrophism, this theory of catastrophism proposed no gradual change. The idea was rejected that life evolved slowly and continuously. Instead, it was believed catastrophism believed in a series of abrupt revolutions. So Cuvier's work in the Paris Basin revealed fossil layers separated by gaps where entire groups of organisms vanished, only to be replaced by different species in the next layer. So that's why, from this particular observation, he had interpreted these gaps as evidence of mass extinction events, each followed by new creation. So this was catastrophism. So the objection of the current theory is same as previous one, no scientific experiment to support this hypothesis and mostly based on imaginary concepts. Now there is another theory called the cosmozoic theory or the panspermia theory, which suggested that life did not really originate on Earth but was actually brought here from celestial bodies or other planets. And this theory proposed that microbes, which were referred to as cosmozoa, could actually survive the harsh conditions of space and were delivered to Earth via meteorites or comets. And once these cosmozoa reached Earth, the spores reached the Earth, then they developed into various life forms that we see today. So again, this theory actually had gained traction in early 20th century, where Richter and Arrhenius strongly supported the idea of panspermia, and they supported that life could be seeded from space. And this theory was initially really strengthened by the discovery of microbes in meteorites. So that actually eventually strengthened this particular cosmologic theory. And discovery of microbes in meteorites suggested that life could potentially survive interplanetary travel. So, what were the criticisms and limitations if we talk about? Um, Lack of evidence, definitely. There is currently no direct evidence supporting the transfer of life from other planets to Earth. And critics argue that while the theory suggests a mechanism for life's arrival, it does not really explain how life originated in the first place. Survival concerns. Questions remain about how spores really could survive the extreme conditions of space, including radiation and vacuum, and still be viable upon reaching the Earth. Scientific acceptance. This theory is often viewed as a fringe hypothesis within the scientific community, as it does not really provide a comprehensive explanation for the origin of life. Next, another one is the theory of eternity of life, which is again a philosophical concept, suggesting that life is infinite and eternal and it does not really end with death. So, it's completely philosophical, goes into the realm of souls and spirits, where the belief is that souls and spirits continue to exist even after the physical body dies, and like these spirits or souls enter a new form of existence. So this theory has been around for centuries and is often associated with various religions and spiritual beliefs. And different theory of eternity of life basically goes into like philosophical things, how like how God really, how there was an explosion, how God's hand came, angels were there, all these stuffs were there, like are part of theory of eternity of life. Okay. And how even after one dies, one still lingers around. So all these are part of theory of eternity of life. Finally, an scientific like based on scientific evidence and experimental evidence, the chemical theory or the primary abiogenesis came into picture, which offers one of the most compelling evidence-based explanations. It actually proposes that life began through a series of natural chemical processes and which were actually amenable in the early conditions of Earth. And the modern form of this theory was actually developed by scientists like Oparin and Hanlon and later supported experimentally by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. So, this chemical theory or primary abiogenesis not only explores how simple inorganic compounds have evolved into complex biomolecules, but it also goes deep into the gradual formation of protocells and ultimately the living cells that we see today. So, the hypothesis of abiogenesis was proposed with the condition that non living materials can give rise to life in the conditions of primitive Earth. The conditions of primitive Earth is actually different from the present conditions. The present conditions of Earth actually do not permit abiogenesis. So, the idea of chemical theory was put forward by these two scientists, Oparin and Hadlin, and the following assumptions were made. One is the spontaneous generation of life under present environment is not possible. And Earth's atmosphere nearly 1 billion years is very different, like was very different from the current conditions. And primitive Earth's atmosphere was reducing in nature. Okay, this is something we should remember, like questions come from here as well. And under these conditions, the chemical molecules or inorganic molecules react with each other through a series of reactions to form organic substrates and other biomolecules. And the solar energy and UV radiation provided the energy for chemical reactions. Okay. So this hypothesis, the hypothesis was proposed by Oparin and Handel, but it was actually experimentally carried out by Miller and Urey. They actually mimicked the primitive Earth environment, and the experimental setup consists of a glass flask, condenser here, and a liquid flask interconnected with tubes and a source of electric spark to provide energy. Okay, this one here. And the mixture of methane, different gases were introduced, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. The ratio was 2 is to 2 is to 1, and water and like water vapor was there at 800 degrees Celsius. Then the mixture was enclosed in the glass apparatus for 18 days, and the energy was provided in the form of spark, uh, supplying electricity via these electrodes here. Okay, it is supplying this particular electricity inside this apparatus, uh, which tried to eventually mimic the conditions of primitive Earth. And while passing the mixture, gases were passed through a liquid flask to simulate the volcano here. And the mixture was collected from the stock cork and analyzed using chromatographic and calorimetric techniques. So this mixture was collected from the analysis of this mixture indicates the presence of amino acids, simple amino acids, glycine, alanine, even aspartate, and nitrogen-based adenine and simple sugar ribose. And in addition, hydrogen cyanide, formaldehyde, and other active intermediate compounds like acetylene and cyanoacetylene were found. So, what might be the possible chemical reactions uh, and how these particular products were formed? These equations show that. Okay, how amino acids like glycine and stuff were formed, how glycine, alanine, formaldehyde, cyanide, etc. were formed. These reactions are given here, possible reactions. Now, the steps proposed in the origin of life. So, according to the chemical theory, the origin of life have four major steps if we talk about it. The first one is the formation of inorganic molecules. So, the high temperature of primitive Earth didn't allow the condensation of atoms to form inorganic molecules. And as the temperature went down, condensation gave rise to simpler molecules. Different atoms eventually condensed and gave rise to simpler molecules. And the most abundant elements on the primitive Earth were hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. And reaction of these molecules give rise to different gases such as hydrogen, nitrogen, ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. And the energy for these reactions were provided by the sources were sunlight, volcanic eruptions, lightning. Okay, the first one, formation of inorganic molecules. Second one is the spontaneous formation of monomeric organic compounds or complex organic compounds. The simple molecules eventually interact with each other to form simple monomeric organic compounds. And these molecules were sugar, fatty acids, glycerol, amino acids, and organic bases like purines or pyrimidines. So, purines and pyrimidines are actually one of the building blocks of the genetic material that we have today, DNA and RNA. The reactions between the inorganic compounds or inorganic molecules to give simple organic molecules occurs in reducing environment inside ocean, and the inorganic molecules were condensed in the form of rain as temperature of earth came down, and hence what we can say is here the spontaneous formation of monomeric organic compounds, both inorganic and simple organic compounds, were present in the primordial ocean. Okay, this one here, this is taken, this particular picture is taken from the lecture slides only. Oh, sorry. And next comes the third point, which eventually formed complex organic compounds. This one here, the small, simpler organic compounds again reacted to form complex organic compounds. Simple amino acids react to form polypeptides. Sugar react to form really large saccharides or polysaccharides. Fatty acids and glycerol combined give fat or lipids, and heat of the sun was utilized for providing energy for these reactions. Next came the formation of molecular aggregates. Spontaneous formation of molecular aggregates, like large organic molecules, again came together to form colloidal aggregates. The term was quacervates. A layer of water molecule forms around the protein molecules present in quacervates, and the membrane present around the molecules protect the molecule and bring high local concentration to enhance the chemical reactions here. These are the quacervates that is being talked about in this point. Next, if we talk about quacervates, these colloidal aggregates absorb protein and other molecules from the ocean. This eventually results in the growth of these quacervates as well as the internal complexity, and eventually the quacervate can divide into multiple smaller cells. So, and again, these quacervates are the initial species present in the ocean, eventually, which forms the primary cells. This one, again, this process is accomplished in two steps. One is the formation of eobionts or protocells. Quacervates actually have the ability to take up new molecules to replace degraded molecules and maintain the size. And quacervates have the basic property of living system. However, it doesn't really have the complex molecules like enzymes for catalysis and all. So this process of acquiring new molecules was not really regulated. And eventually when nucleic acid was entrapped within the quacervates and process of division became precise and controlled. So this form of quacervates with the nucleic acid was termed as protocells or eobionts. Next came the formation of the very first cells. So the protein molecules and appearance of enzymes have enhanced the synthesis of several biomolecules in eobionts or protocells, and RNA and DNA developed, and these molecules have taken over protein synthesis. So interaction of lipid and protein allowed the formation of biomembrane, which has provided selectivity in the primitive cell for intake or exclusion of material. It allowed the growth of appearance of membrane-bound protocell that has eventually given first cell on Earth. So the mutation in DNA and selection of fast-growing cell give rise to the appearance of first primordial cell, and the first cellular form appeared on Earth approximately 2000 million years ago. Now, when we talk about biological evolution, it is actually descent with inherited modification. So, if we talk about biological evolution, it will include small scale evolution like changes in the frequency of different gene versions in a population from one generation to the next, to large scale evolution like the descent of different species from a shared ancestor over the course of many generations. So, biological evolution actually helps us to understand the living world around us as well as its history. So what is the explanation given for um, biological evolution? It is not really simply a matter of change over time. So it is a accumulation of several changes happening around, like caterpillars turn into moths, trees lose and regrow their leaves, mountain ranges rise and erode. So if we talk about these changes, these aren't really biological evolution, because here these ones, like caterpillars turning into moths, trees losing and regrowing their leaves, mountain ranges rising and eroding, so these don't involve descent with inherited modifications. Okay, so these changes aren't really biological evolution. So all life on Earth shares a common ancestor, just as you and your cousins share a common grandmother, right? So this common ancestor gave rise to the diverse species that we see documented in the fossil records as well as we see all around us today. So evolution means that we are all distant cousins, humans and oak trees, hummingbirds and whales. Okay. So if we talk about this change over time, this is not really biological evolution, but this like inherited uh, modifications from a very ancestral living being uh, can be termed biological evolution. Now, in general, we talk about, oh no, wait. think. Okay. So if we talk about fishes of a different color, so zebra fish is actually a model organism, like we have Drosophila, right? Drosophila, like in general bacteria, E. coli bacteria, bacterial model organism too, where really experimentalists and researchers study these organisms to delineate fundamental processes or disease models, right? So zebrafish is one of the models, which is actually a small and flashy aquarium pet, but it is a very unlikely informant on questions of human genetics. However, its genome could hold the keys to understanding several diseases, and it has been used for understanding several diseases and still being used. And surprisingly, the genes underlying human skin color could eventually be understood from zebrafish. So, where's the evolution from here? So, how did scientists get from a golden fish to human ethnic groups? So, evolutionary relationships between humans and fish eventually helps illuminate how and why human skin color differences evolved in the first place. Okay, so all these, so this is just one of the trivial examples that I gave. And then you have tiktaalik is technically a fish which is complete with gills and scales, but it has a flattened head of a crocodile and unusual fins here. It has a combination of features that show the evolutionary transition between swimming fishes and their four-legged descendants, including amphibians, dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and humans. Okay. So this is what we see, the descent of different kind of organisms that we see around us today from a common ancestor existed long like billion of years ago. So what exactly are we talking about? What exactly has been modified? So evolution occurs when there is a change in the heritable information passing, which is being passed from one generation to the next. And changes in gene frequency within a population over time, like birds with genes that produce wide beaks, went from being rare to being common over multiple generations. Biological evolution also includes changes in DNA that does not code for genes and changes in heritable information not encoded in DNA at all. So, in all these cases, modifications are heritable and can be passed on to the next generation. We are talking about long term changes here. Okay. So, now based on one example, so we see beetles on a diet here. Okay. Brown colored and green colored beetles on a diet. Now, imagine this population experienced years of drought where few plants are there that the beetles can feed upon. Now, all the beetles have, at that particular point, same chances of survival and reproduction. However, the food resources are restricted or limited. So, the beetles in the later generations are smaller. Earlier, the beetles are larger in size, and in later generations, the beetles become smaller in size than the um, pre-drought generations of beetles. Okay, this is one example. Now, beetles of a different color. Now we have green and brown beetles here. Okay. Now most of the beetles in this population, say suppose 90% have a gene which encodes for this green color, and few of them have a gene which makes them brown. And eventually several generations later, uh, due to some conditions, due to certain situations, the brown beetles are more in number as compared to the green beetles. Okay. So these are two different situations. Now, when we talk about the first situation where we looked at the difference in size in example, it came because of environmental influences. The supply, nutrient supply or the food supply was limited. It wasn't, the size change wasn't really because of a change in the heritable information. Therefore, example one is not really evolution. Now, because the small body size in this population was not genetically determined, it is temporary. If the beetle's food supply is restored, this generation of small bodied beetles will eventually produce normal sized offspring. Now, when we talk about the shift in the color frequency in example 2, that is evolution because these two generations of the same population are genetically different. Okay, there has been a change in the heritable information, and this shift will be passed down to the next generation and maybe future generations as well, or there might be eventually more changes introduced at the genetic level. So when we talk about the Human Genome Project, it has revealed the string of 3 billion base pairs that represents our genetic sequence, and still we know very little about the meaning of that sequence. Since all life on Earth shares common ancestors, and because we and the other species have inherited so many of the genes from those ancestors, we can learn more about our genome by studying the genes of other species. For example, researchers can actually experimentally manipulate a gene in another organism. We looked at zebrafish model to figure out how the gene works and then look for the homologous gene in humans. The version of the gene that humans also inherited from an ancestor we share with the study organism. Now, again, so there are different theories of evolution as well. The very first one is, Lamarckism, which actually explains evolution through two main ideas. First is the law of use and disuse, which actually states that organs used frequently become stronger and more developed, while those which are not used eventually degenerate and may disappear. So Lamarck actually used examples of development of webbed feet in aquatic birds through constant stretching and the loss of limbs in snakes uh, when because limbs weren't in use while moving through narrow spaces. And the second idea is the inheritance of acquired characters, which claims that traits or physical or in general characteristics acquired during an organism's lifetime are passed on to offspring. So Lamarck explained the evolution of giraffe by suggesting that repeated stretching of the neck by the short-necked ancestors. Uh, suggested that the short-necked giraffe eventually had to reach out for, leaves or food higher up, like present at higher heights. So eventually, that repeated stretching of the neck led to longer necks of giraffes that we see today, and this was eventually inherited and further extended over generations. So, however, Lamarckism faced strong criticism. While the law of use and disuse is still accepted, the inheritance of acquired characters is not. So then scientists like Wiesmann came up, who showed that changes in body cells do not really affect the germ cells, meaning that acquired traits cannot really alter genes or be inherited. So as a result, Lamarckism is considered scientifically untenable. So Wiesmann cut the tails of rats, but still, even after generations, like eventually reproduction led to like normal rats with tails. It didn't really generate, the offsprings weren't really tailless. Okay, so eventually this inheritance of acquired traits, this particular statement was refuted. So we talked about the major objection was from August Wiesmann. Wiesmann's theory of continuity of germ plasm. He suggested somatic cells and germ cells, and he's told that the nuclei present in the germ cell is responsible for inheritance of characters, whereas somatic cells contains nuclei which respond to environmental factors and use or disuse. So acquired characters remains within the somatic cells, and as a result, this theory supports the idea that acquired characters are not really inherited. So, and this is what I was talking about. He conducted a conclusive experiment on rats where he had to cut their tails for 80 generations, but still it didn't really produce tailless rats. Okay. Then eventually there are many more things like boring of, piercing of ears and stuff, like in women or like men as well, for thousands of years. Uh, but eventually when a baby is born, the baby has proper ears. It's not really pierced. So things like that. So all these are actually refuting the theory of Lamarckism, and especially especially refuting the um, statement of inheritance of acquired characters. Okay. But however, there is a small branch called neo-Lamarckism, so where there are evidences to support the inheritance of the effect of radiation or chemicals on germ cells and the resulting change or evidence for the inheritance of acquired characters revived the Lamarckism, which eventually was modified into neo-Lamarckism. So the postulates are Germ cells are not always immune from the effect of environment. The environmental conditions can eventually accumulate over the time. Germ cells may be affected directly by the environment without any effect immediately, and germ cells may carry acquired character to the next generation. Okay, so these are some of the possible things supporting Lamarckism, some parts of Lamarckism, and then finally came Darwinism, which is widely accepted and scientifically uh, like really supported. And so it's based on variations. So Darwin observed that no two living forms were exactly alike. Diversity tends to appear even among members belonging to the same species. So Darwin eventually paid particular attention to the small, fluctuating, and continuous variations which appeared randomly. So according to him, these continuous variations eventually help one living organism to win the struggle for existence. And large discontinuous variations which appeared suddenly were considered as mere sports of nature, like very random events and rare and random events. Therefore, he ignored this part. And eventually, survival of the fittest came. The organisms which possess suitable variations helped actually can win the struggle for existence by better adapting to the environmental conditions. And these fitter organisms can survive and propagate their variations, or pass on these variations onto the next generation, eventually helping the next generation to thrive or survive the existing environmental conditions. And the others with unsuitable variations eventually get wiped out. And then the famous natural selection theory comes into picture. This is the most important deduction of Darwin. Natural selection is the process by which individuals possessing favorable variations enjoy a competitive advantage over the others. And these fitter individuals are better adapted to their environment. Therefore, they survive in comparatively greater numbers and produce more offspring, and the rest with disadvantageous variations or disadvantageous traits fail to adapt properly to the existing conditions, surrounding conditions, and therefore get eliminated by natural selection. So the favorable variations which are the cause of success are handed down to the offspring by inheritance. Therefore, the number of the favored individuals increase rapidly. And if natural selection operates for a longer period of time, these favorable variations which have attained the survival value are aggregated and intensified and really highlighted over generations until the original ancestral forms are thoroughly changed into a new species. If you take, for example, um, Darwinism explains the evolution of modern giraffe in the following manner. So he says that the original ancestral forms were short-necked, leaf-eating animals. And Darwin assumed that as a result of individual variation, some of them had slightly longer or shorter necks in comparison with the population's average neck length. And the longer necked forms were better adapted to get the leaf or foliages situated at a higher, situated a little higher on the trees, and consequently eventually they were better fed than the shorter necked fellows, and they produced proportionally greater number of offsprings, the longer necked ones. However, again there were criticism and flaws in Darwin's theory as well. Just a minute. Yeah, the criticism to Darwin's theory were, in spite of there are like strong evidences as well. However, Darwinism suffered from serious drawbacks. How? So the variations that were accepted by Darwin to be the chief tool in the process of evolution, and he believed that the small continuous variations of fluctuating type were inherited by the offspring. But what eventually caused this variation? There was no knowledge or there was no comments on that. At this point, the science of genetics actually was unknown. So the laws of inheritance were uh, weren't explored. So most of the fluctuating variations considered by Darwin to be important factors in his theory of natural selection are not genotypic, and as such they are not really inherited. So Darwin, like Lamarck, believed in the inheritance of acquired characters, a fact which is not really proved by genetics. And the natural selection mainly operates in one direction, often leading to over specialization and ultimate extinction. Like if we talk about the canine teeth of tiger and antlers of the Irish elk increased progressively in size because the characteristics in both the cases were favored by natural selection. But however, the structures became so large that instead of being helpful, they became an obstruction. Actually, became a little problematic in their struggle for existence and led to the extinction of the species. And the natural selection theory fails to account for the degeneracy which is often observed in the parasitic forms. Essence of Darwinian natural selection is the elimination of the unsuitable forms. So it is better to name maybe the theory of natural rejection. And Darwin actually observed large continuous variations or mutations to occur in nature. However, he completely ignored them or rejected them as they occurred less frequently. But mutations are genotypic variations and they have now been recognized as important factors in the origin of new species. So, in spite of its weakness, Darwinism is still actually accepted as one of the important factors in evolution. And thanks to the untiring efforts of Huxley, the great champion of natural selection, and others like Weismann, the theory has been firmly established. Now, there's another Hugo de Vries theory, and this where he proposed the theory of mutation. And this mutation theory was published in 1901, and he was a Dutch botanist. So, this is mainly based on his experiments on a plant called evening primrose. Okay. And so Devries found the evening primrose, the scientific name is Oenothera lamarckiana. So Devries found that certain strikingly different forms of this particular flower or evening primrose appeared suddenly among a population of normal type of evening primrose. So this different forms, he called them mutants, and a mutant is a variant which arises abruptly among normal forms. So mutant always breeds true, that is, it produces offsprings like itself. And the term mutation or saltation is applied, and the term mutation or saltation is applied to a sudden large change or discontinuous variation in organisms, and this can be inherited. So, according to this theory of mutation, mutations are the real cause for the evolution of a new species. And numerous mutants may be produced in nature. They are then subjected to natural selection, which determines the types that could survive. And the mutants which survived the struggle for existence are responsible for origin of new species. So what the criticism was, mutation actually often produces monsters which have no evolutionary significance. Mutations occur infrequently and therefore they cannot be regarded as the only factor in evolution. And mutation theory accepts natural selection as the controlling agent in evolution. So now if we talk about the four processes which drive the basic mechanism of evolutionary change, one is mutation, definitely is one of them, which could cause beetle parents with genes for bright. If we go back to the example of beetles, which changed colors from green to brown predominantly, and that would make genes for brown coloration more frequent in the population than they were before the mutation. Either there can be migration or gene flow. Some individuals from a population of brown beetles might have moved into a population of green beetles. That would make genes for brown coloration more frequent in the green beetle population than they were before the brown beetles migrated. So, in evolutionary biology, migration is also known as gene flow. And another is genetic drift. Now, suppose in one generation, brown beetles happened to have many offspring survive to reproduce. And in the same generation, a number of green beetles were killed randomly when probably someone stepped on them and had no offspring. So the next generation will eventually have more brown beetles than the previous generation, but just by chance. Okay, so in this case, it is called a genetic drift. Then there comes natural selection. Now, suppose the green beetles are easier for the birds to spot and hence eat. Okay, against maybe uh, a lighter background or something like that. And thus, brown beetles are a little more likely to survive and produce offspring. So they eventually pass their genes for brown color onto their offspring. So in the next generation, brown beetles are more common than they were in the previous generation. So all of these mechanisms can actually cause changes in the frequencies of genes and other genetic elements in populations. And so all of them are mechanisms of evolutionary change. However, natural selection and genetic drift can only change the frequency of different genes and genetic elements. For example, making white beaks or green beetles more or less common, so they cannot introduce fundamentally new traits to a population. And without genetic variation, some key mechanisms of evolutionary change like natural selection and genetic drift cannot really operate. So there are three primary sources of a new genetic variation. One is mutation, one is gene flow, and another is mating, which introduces new gene combinations into a population. And this genetic shuffling is another important source of genetic variation. Like natural selection can actually produce impressive adaptations as well that help organisms to survive and reproduce. Few examples are you have orchids which actually fool the wasps into mating them. The wasps come and eventually see these orchids which resemble the wasp species, and by mating, this false mating phenomenon eventually leads to pollination of these orchids. Then there is this non-venomous king snakes, this one here, this longer one, which actually mimic the actually very poisonous coral snakes and can actually save themselves from predators. Then there's katydids, which camouflage like and look like leaves to protect themselves from predators. We can even directly observe natural selection occurring. So very convincing data actually show the shape of finches beaks on the Galapagos Islands has tracked weather patterns. So after droughts, the finch population has deeper, stronger beaks that let them eat tougher seeds. So the beak sizes and shapes changed eventually depending on what kind of seeds they are feeding on. Okay. Or what kind of, in general, what kind of food they are having. Now, if we talk about industrial melanism, human activity has led to environmental changes that have caused populations to evolve through natural selection. And the striking example many of you might know is the peppered moth, okay, which may have either light or dark color. And during the Industrial Revolution, when air pollution actually darkened the tree trunks, the dark colored forms were favored because they were better camouflaged and eventually could survive and became more common and weren't easily spotted by predators like birds, etc. But when population was later reduced, the light colored forms rebounded and became more common. So, natural selection triggered by human activity can often be observed and documented. So, in evolution, fitness is about success at surviving and reproducing. It's not about exercise and strength. And fitness is actually a relative thing. So, when we talk about a genotype type's fitness, it actually depends on the environment in which the organism lives. The fittest genotype during an ice age, for example, is probably not the fittest genotype once the ice age is over. Okay. So fitness is actually a handy concept because it lumps everything that matters to natural selection like survival, mate finding, reproduction into one idea. The fittest individual is not necessarily the strongest, fastest, or the biggest one. A genotype's fitness eventually includes its ability to survive, find a mate, produce offspring, and ultimately leave its genes in the next generation. Okay. So, caring for your offspring, producing thousands of young, many of whom won't survive, and sporting fancy feathers that attract females are actually a burden to the health and survival of the parent. So, these strategies, however, can increase fitness because they also help the parents get more of their offspring into the next generation. Okay, so let's just look. through some of the questions here. So, which theory is similar to stating God is the creator of earth and organisms? So, eternity of life suggests that it goes on, as in there's no end or anything. It talks about souls and stuff. Okay. And cosmozoic, it spans Permia, like from outer space or planet spores were handed over meteorites or etc. carried spores all the way onto the earth. So what eventually, and modern theory is the biological, I mean chemical one. And so the God is the creator of earth and organisms is supported by the theory of catastrophism. The reason for the presence of hydrogen and hydrogen compounds, sorry, the reason for the presence of hydrogen and hydrogen compounds with water to remain within the atmosphere of primitive Earth is reducing environment. Okay, and definitely another is gravitational force. Okay, which actually holds these um, things together on the surface. And under reducing environment, they have been able to produce the primitive molecules. But the question asks the reason for the presence of hydrogen and hydrogen compounds with water to remain within the atmosphere of the primitive Earth, like they are not really flying off, is due to gravitational force. Okay. Now, to disprove the theory of spontaneous generation, Louis Pasteur, with the experiment involving an S-shaped tube, had given the following analysis. So, what was the analysis? Appearance of microbes in the neck of the tube with condensed water. Disappearance of microbes in the neck of the tube with condensed water. Water definitely not, because the neck was actually exposed to the air, so it wasn't really very sterile. And appearance of microbes inside the flask with condensed water in S-shaped tube? No, because the S-shaped tube, the sterile broth inside was actually kind of not reachable or not within the reach of the microbes as such. And no growth in the flask after breaking S tube. No, after breaking the S tube, it eventually gave access to microbes, and the sterile broth was like did show microbial growth. Okay, so the correct option will be appearance of microbes in the neck of the tube, not in the sterile broth with condensed water. Okay, the theory strongly supported by Arrhenius for life on Earth is the theory of panspermia. The mixture of gases in Miller-Urey experiment in support of the chemical theory is, so they had taken methane, ammonia, and hydrogen in 2 is to 2 is to 1 ratio. Correct option is this fourth one. The correct assumption for the spontaneous formation of monomeric organic compounds according to the chemical theory of life is complex molecules interact with each other to form simple monomeric organic compounds. It's the complete opposite actually. The reactions occur in oxidizing environment inside the ocean. No, it was a reducing atmosphere. The organic compounds and simple organic compounds were present in the atmosphere. Um, as the temperature, we are talking about spontaneous formation of monomeric organic compounds. So this option, the third option, doesn't really go well with that. As the temperature of the earth is lowered, the inorganic molecules were condensed in the form of rain. Okay, so this is the correct option according to the assumption of spontaneous formation of monomeric organic compounds. Okay, so eventually they condensed and eventually formed larger, like complex compounds, and those compounds eventually formed aggregates, eventually giving rise to complex biomolecules and eventually life on Earth. Okay. Now, which of the following is false regarding the appearance of mutations in offsprings in Hugo de Vries' experiment in evening primrose? So it was like everything was there except constant uh, changes. Okay, so he proposed mutations which were actually large step events. So here, uh, he observed like the subtle but significant difference between different wild type variants. Normal plant was taken and seeds were collected through self pollination. Majority of seeds were normal like their parents except few ones, and these seeds were quite different from their parents. So the plants with variants were true to give rise to plants with similar characteristics. And eventually in the next generation, it breeds to give plants with majority of plants similar to their parents but few plants with different variants. Hence, he observed that in each generation, majority of the offsprings are similar to the parents, but it gives few offsprings with variants. So eventually, De Vries found that mutations were appearing suddenly and were inherited by the progeny. And four different types of plants. One were progressive with newer traits. We have this option here. Retrogressive that had reduced or lost traits as compared to their parents. This option is also there. Degressive, like plants with weak or having showing low survival capacity. This one is also there. And one is inconsistent or inconstant, not really very constant, because these plants are unstable and they resemble parents sometimes, as well as they produce variants. So it's not really constant or stable uh, characteristics. Okay. So the correct option is constant and plants are stable. This is false regarding uh, the appearance of mutation in offsprings in Hugo de Vries's experiment. Okay. What is the principal factor for natural selection as recognized by Darwin and Wallace? So it's predominantly the environmental conditions that exist around, or like availability of resources, etc. So if we talk about Darwin and Wallace here, there was Malthus's study on population genetics and stuff. Okay, so where Darwin and Wallace each read Malthus differently. So Darwin actually considered the food supply had to be on an average constant with the increase of population geometrically, whereas Wallace actually saw the growth or depletion of a population due to food availability or in general resource availability and the ability of a given species to exploit those resources. So Darwin actually saw competition as taking place between individuals, whereas Wallace actually saw competition taking place between populations. And hence competition led to modifications of a group. Uh, if we talk about Darwin, whereas competitions leading to changes in population size of several groups, if we talk about Wallace's uh, observations. And Darwin focused on individual struggles for existence, whereas Wallace concentrated on the population growth as powerful modifying force in nature. Wallace actually saw evolution taking place not at an individual level but in a demographic context. So both Charles Darwin's and Wallace's views had problems. So Wallace failed to clearly distinguish varieties and variations, and Darwin's hypothesis was premised upon the inheritance of acquired characteristics, a notion exploded years later by Weismann's failed attempt to confirm the phenomenon in the experimental removal of successive generations of rat tails. Now, which among the following metal is used to determine the age of the fossils? So, in general, if you talk about the how to determine the age of fossils, one is the relative dating methods. Okay, where a relative dating technique, the position and erosion rate of rock in a particular environment is looked at. So, older rocks are actually situated deeper, having ancient fossils, and superficial rocks are having fossils, usually have fossils, uh, suggest like towards the recent years, okay, which have been fossilized in recent times, not and the older ones or ancient ones are actually deeper down. So, but if we talk about the absolute dating methods, these use the spontaneous decay of unstable radioactive nuclei into stable radioactive nuclei at a constant and known rate. And there can be uranium-led technique where rocks containing uranium in the form of uh, like rocks containing uranium can decay spontaneously to form plumbum or lead, and the half lives can be checked and calculated. And the content of uranium and lead in a rock or a fossil can be used to determine the age of that particular rock or fossil. And then there can be carbon dating, or there can be K40 potassium dating as well. So out of all these ones, we have potassium is the correct answer. Now if we talk about uranium lead technique, so this has been in use since quite long time, um, and that we talked about. So this is what the uranium can actually go under, like undergo radioactive decay to form finally lead, which is stable. Okay. And another is carbon dating, where radioactive carbon is found naturally in rock, and this has 5600 years as its half life. So the decay gives nitrogen, and carbon dating technique can be used to measure fossil age up to 25,000 years old. Then another is this potassium argon dating, where potassium K40 is usually found in the rocks of all kinds, and its life is 1.3 into 10 to the power 9 years, and eventually it can disintegrate or decay to form argon. Okay, so that's it for today's tutorial. Uh, Again, we'll meet tomorrow with week three's content and questions. Okay, so I will stop sharing the screen now. Um, Okay. Hi, Vashisht. So, can you please tell about the assignments and interactive sessions? So, assignments are actually mostly, I think, 20 questions are given now. And assignments that by the due date, you can submit as many assignments, like as many answers you can. And but these assignments are eventually taken into consideration for the final um, your grading and stuff. And interactive sessions, these interactive sessions actually, so for suppose if I talk about basics of biology course, right? So basics of biology course has several TAs assigned. Okay, so where like this tutorial session where another TA will be there on Monday or something like that, where eventually we try to sum up and summarize the week's content. You can join any one of the sessions, and we even record these sessions and put it on YouTube. You can watch those, like YouTube links are shared, so you can watch those videos as well. So interactive sessions are eventually the tutorial portions where you can get to summarize the thing, or we will be discussing some questions based on the assignments only. And I think at the end of the course there will be one an interactive session with the professor himself, uh, where you get to interact with him directly, ask questions and all. And eligibility, I think eligibility is nicely mentioned in the course requirements and all. Think otherwise there's no special eligibility as such. Okay, but you have to submit the assignments by the due date, otherwise it won't be counted or graded. Okay, and yes, there is that final exam that is there. If you have registered for the exam, you can give that exam there. Okay, all right. So I will end this session. See you tomorrow if you guys are available. Thank you for joining. Thank you. I will end the meeting for all of you.